But we had some different influences as well, and I want to show that. The second place in Syria that pops up that connects all this is something that I've been studied for a good 6 or 8 months because it's a fascinating place, and again, nobody talks about it. I don't know why. It's called Ebla. And in Ebla, Syria...
How do you spell that?
Ebla. And one of the reasons it's overlooked is that we see the classic examples in Ebla of very, very primitive work on top, just like we see everywhere else in the world, but then sections of it are these ancient bases. And I have images of that here. I don't know if you're going to be able to really find that, but basically what we're seeing is two completely distinct types of architecture. And I don't know if you want to look, especially this one, look at the big blocks versus the small crude stuff on top. Some of you can...
Corner of the screen for this as well.
Can you notice the difference between those two?
Yes, one is like rounded, like
big, large blocks.
rocks. The other one is those blocks similar to this.
Similar to Sernaki Tepe as well.
Yeah.
So we see that, yes, the megalithic building is there. And if anything, it actually looks more like Sernaki Tepe than Kavis Tepe, which is weird. So what I'm trying to say is, Ebla, Syria isn't that far from Ain Dara. But the thing is that Sernaki Tepe, the way that they constructed those blocks, looks very similar to Ebla. Whereas Kavis Tepe and Kefkalesi, again, the same region, look like Ain Dara, showing you that the influences from there diverged. They started going into different parts of the world, but they were in the same area to start, is what I'm saying. How that came about, I don't know. I don't know why one group would prefer to build slightly different than another, and then like why one would be only want to do basalt. Like, so there's questions we don't know. We don't know why they made the decisions they did, but what connects and syncs this whole thing is that the second largest library ever found in the ancient world, besides the Ashurbanipal library we talked about, was in Ebla. Now in Ebla, they found what's called the Royal Library and King's List. And in that, they found ancient writings in their library that were Sumerian, Babylonian, Turkish from this area, Armenian area. They found Cyprus writings from the Mediterranean, and they found writings from Egypt. I think even Greek too. Everything. Right there. Why? Well, you go into Ebla and you look it up, you find out that it was like this center of the old world where to get to the Mediterranean, you had to pass through Ebla. And then to get to the Black Sea and then the Lake Von, you had to go through Ebla because clearly everybody was traveling through the Mediterranean. Obviously, maritime travel was very significant.
Right.
So Ebla was like the crossing of all of this. And we have all the writings there in that journal. In the library. They're all there. And so Ebla, if you look at a map, Ebla is right before the Mediterranean. Like, phew. Meanwhile, right next to Ebla in Lebanon, we find the emergence of gigantic megaliths that look like Ebla but bigger. They look very similar, the type of stone and the type of ways they made the work. The influences of the Ebla architecture is right there in Lebanon, whereas the influences of the more volcanic basalt goes to somewhere else. It's like you can see they're moving around and they're adopting certain sites and they're creating things as they go, right? So as we go along, we learn that Ebla leads to the land of Canaan, which is supposedly where the last of the giants were, and the whole connection to the Book of Enoch. Then we go a little bit further. What we find is that we have done genetic studies of these elongated skulls. Have you seen this?
No.
So in Egypt, we have found some elongated skulls related to Akhenaten, and then we also found elongated skulls in Peru at a place called Paracas. Okay, as well as the elongated skulls we're referring to are not based on cranium enlargement. So they were like mimicking. It looks like what we're finding around the world is. I have one on here if you want to look at it.
Yeah, let me see it.
That's Brian Forster right there. He was one of the curators of the museum at Paracas. Good friend of mine and a great researcher.
So this is a real skull that looks like that?
Yeah. So what they found was not only did they find it there, but this is those other versions of humans I told you about. This is what they were, if you want to know. This is what those bloodlines and what they were. So what we found is that we not only find similar architecture in Peru that we find in the Lake Von area, but you ready for this? Not only did Brian Forrester and Lloyd Pye do genetic testing on the Paracas skulls, but the TV network I work for, Gaia, did an entire showcase where they genetically tested them as well. Through all of these genetic studies, they found the same results. The genetics of the Paracas skulls from Peru came from the Armenian Black Sea area of Lake Van. And they found elongated skulls in a place called Malta in the Mediterranean on an island. And in the hypogeum, this chamber that's basically designed to 432 hertz human consciousness, they found elongated and these aren't just one elongated skull. They're like a graveyard of elongated skulls. And they found them in Paracas. And so they genetically test the ones in Paracas, Peru, to test back to this Lake Van area near the Black Sea. Then they test another whole part of the world in the Mediterranean. And they test at Malta with this, incredibly, if anyone's ever seen the Oracle Chamber in the Hypogeum of Malta, it's like amazing. The way they designed it's beautiful. The skulls, they found elongated skulls there, and they genetically traced them to the exact same spot. Lake Van, in the Armenian highlands of the Mount Ararat region. Both places, across the world, similar architecture, trace back to the same spot. That's why, if we think of the story of the Atrahasis, bringing it back, this bloodline king that's like a demigod that's living like huge amounts of time, lands on Mount Ararat. Everybody else is mostly gone. There was another group. I told you about Akish with Etana. There was like two areas that sort of reemerged again, right? But so just go back to Lake Van for a minute. So think about it. He's this like superhuman that's like a demigod with a bloodline that these three sons go out, and then we find the same architecture, same gods all around the world, same influences, as well as the genetic exact identity of these locations back to the same place, which matches all the bloodlines, biblical bloodlines we showed you.
So not everyone mimicked what we're seeing here, though, in later generations, obviously, if we're just going to talk about the skulls to start with.
Okay, so it looks like these people potentially had a natural large skull.
But it died off at some point.
Yes, and with those groups. And then other groups came along to try to mimic them later, which is sort of like how in Mesopotamia today, in modern-day Iraq, people still look like that.
Why is
Remember?
this...
With the beard and everything?
Yeah, but why is this skull so perfectly preserved?
They had to glue it back together. It was broken.
But still, like it even exists.
Because the Paracas people were protecting them. So there was a group in Peru called the Paracas people, and they were protecting an ancient graveyard that had these demigod influences of these skulls. Because they considered them to be very important to their history. So how does this all tie in together? Well, it basically ties in because we can now trace this trajectory of the ancient Sumerian kings to this reemergence of civilization around Lake Van, and this brand new civilization that I'm calling the Ararat civilization, or Lake Van civilization, depends. And then that was like the emergence of what became the greatest chapter of human history we've ever had in our past.
And what's that?
What eventually rose up to become the Athenians and the Atlanteans. Out of this.
Got it.
And so just to recap in terms of how Atlantis connects, we got to the Athenians, right? Because that's like an easy trajectory, right, to the Greece. But for this, it's described that Chem or Cham was the one that was in charge of Egypt and Africa.
One of the brothers.
Yes. And what it states is that, and I have a book that is an old book from the 1800s that I don't remember the name off my head, but they speculate in that the same thing. And I ignored it originally. And I read this concept in an old book about the Great Pyramid of Giza, and I sort of rejected it right away. But now it turns out I think it's true. And what it states in that is that the Shem or Cham group, went down to and then created the Great Pyramids in Egypt and the land of Chem, and then they traveled through Africa. And then they went to Mauritania, and that's why the Richat structure's there, and that's where the sons of Atlas came from, which then emerged into Atlantis, which we know is ruled by Poseidon, who we know is Enki. So it's like there's two parallel civilizations who are rivaling against each other. And that is basically how the whole thing connects. And then those civilizations destroyed, catastrophes came through, wiped out the old ancient world. Other iterations tried to come along, but over time, myth became legend, and legend became what we thought is not real at all. And now we're realizing that there's an entire incredible chapter of human history that may go back far before even the Younger Dryas.
So considering you just did this over a long period of time, can you sum up exactly, as a review,
Sure.
Basically a repetition of what you've done, what you found, and why it changes
Yeah,
history?
I know, because it's like someone's going to have to listen to 5 hours, right?
Yeah, well, it's not just that. It's that there's long explanations of different mazes and rabbit holes along the way, so I just want to
let me give like a 5-minute summary.
Please.
So,
you have the floor.
I became somewhat of an expert, I guess, studying the ancient Sumerian tablets, Akkadian and Babylonian tablets. And in that, I ended up realizing and understanding that a lot of what used to be mythical cities in there, they were not supposed to really be as old as they say or whatever, were real. And then they were finding evidence of catastrophic events that had occurred there, right? And that allowed me to start piecing putting these pieces together and then create a timeline in which I then got stuck because I couldn't figure out how anything left Sumer. Because there was such an incredible event that occurred, again, that destruction, that all of a sudden there was like a gap between it. And all I had was a legend of Etana with Kish, with this reemergence of the New World, but it didn't explain any of the megaliths anywhere. It didn't explain any of those other things anywhere. And so I was like, it was difficult. I was trying to figure it out. And again, these new discoveries in Eastern Turkey, what happened was these brand new 5 to 9 year discoveries in Eastern Turkey are uncovering the remnants of what looks like a completely unknown previous civilization on Earth. And it's being credited right now falsely to the Eurasian civilization that's very similar to like the Hittites, which is just a later group that came thousands of years later. And what we're finding is that there's a direct connection between the ancient tablets of what happened to the Sumerian kings and how they really did land on Mount Ararat, and how there really was like a sacred bloodline that traversed and then basically emerged the civilizations of Lake Von, the Ararat civilizations, which at that point, a new chapter of human civilization seems to have started. And what I mean by that is sophistication seems to have come out of nowhere. And it started at Lake Von, though. And then those giant megaliths and precision seemed to spread all over the world and created the Great Pyramids of Giza, and then eventually gave rise to the ancient Athenian civilization that predated the Greeks, and then the Atlantean civilization out in the Atlantic. And that entire story seems to be interconnected by both new archaeological sites, DNA testing, as well as these ancient bloodlines that we're studying.
Amazing stuff, man. Amazing stuff. I mean, it's so cool to me that people, you can get really interested in something as you did. I mean, you were interested in this for a long time, but you really got into it like 10 years ago. And you just kind of keep going down, using all the public resources available, connecting with people in the space as well to get more voices and information. And then eventually you're able to land on the right thing and track down something that, again, like when I look at stuff like this, it's like, even if you're 30% right about stuff, this is huge. I mean,
it is.
There's a lot,
right.
There's a lot there. And like people like to talk about like in an urban mythological type way about El Dorado or Atlantis or something, but these are potentially insanely advanced civilizations that have existed in places that we can see right now that we have no concept of in this world, where we've made all this innovation and all these things that are supposed to be able to help us look back in time, and yet we seem to just take the one definition of things and look back only a certain way. It's an amazing thing, man.
Yeah, and I feel very lucky to have this in my lap, and I want to do justice and be respectful of their story, our story. I want to tell it in the way that's try not to be biased or trying to inject my own things into it. I think that the ancient people were incredible, and I think that if anything, we're trying to get back to them, not the other way around. And the way that I look at this is, look, these discoveries in Eastern Turkey around Lake Von are so new that it's almost hard to wrap our heads around how new they are, because we haven't had anything new like that found in a long time. And they're, again, 5 to 9 years old, And those archaeologists, thank you, Istanbul University, all those people.
Yeah,
you guys
seriously.
may not know what you're doing, but you are uncovering the missing link of history, if anybody from that listens to this. And I want to say that I'm in talks about creating a mini doc series or something with this, and I'm looking for funding and potential avenues to be on the first plane to Eastern Turkey, to Lake Van.
That would be awesome. Yeah, I think you have to get out there.
I need to get out to there, and I know exactly what I'm looking for, and I need to. It's time. I feel like this is like the missing piece of our entire story that we've been trying to figure out. I think that this understanding that comes out of this will forever change both our understanding of our past and who we really are in the future.
Mm-hmm. It's heavy shit, man. It's really fucking heavy. But, I've waited on, I wanted you to be able to go through this and land it all day because we're on the second podcast now, obviously, and you've been going through all the context of everything. But along the way, as I've hinted when it's happened a few times, you've been going through the things that tie back to like pyramids.
Okay, you want to talk about
Giza
pyramids again, yeah.
And stuff like that. So I haven't really stopped you from going off and going on to that all the way. But the pyramids are something that, I feel like the internet is so informed on at this point. And it's a mystery to me that I didn't get interested. I mean, I didn't get interested in a lot of this stuff until maybe like a year or two ago in a lot of ways. So I still feel like such a novice new student to it. But, we were looking at the Cuban ruins underwater earlier. They clearly have pyramid, I guess, like elements there at the very least.
They've been called by the geologists and others. It's impossible to be natural.
Right. So we've looked at that. Some things maybe we haven't talked as much about today is the evidence of that in South America as well. We know about the most famous ones in Egypt. There are other structures around the world that people have tied back to pyramids or similar technology, if you will, in air quotes there. But when we're looking at Egypt, the base question, just starting there, that I'd love to know, and you started to go towards this earlier, but I don't think you got all the way there, is who do you think built it? And you had been talking about like the ways they built it a little bit and how impressive it was to get some rocks potentially from 1,000 miles away. But what do you know about that? And also if you can relate it to other research like what Ben Van Kerwick has done, or even like Graham and Randall, like what seems to be the possibility there?
So the academic world in terms of the doctrine of history is so stubborn and so incredibly controlled that even with the revelations that the amazing Robert Schoch did, which, by the way, if anything, I feel like Robert Schoch and Bavall are actually the true pioneers, because what they did is the Graham Hancock and Randall Carlsons came right after them, because what Robert Schoch did is that he was brought there from Robert Bavall. I don't know if you know this story.
No,
Robert Bavall was him and John Anthony West were the first two. They were the pioneers of all this. If you want to know how this whole alternative history, lost civilizations, you want to know where it started? It started with them, and I want to give them credit for that, because I think sometimes it gets lost, because John Anthony West, what a hero he was. He's passed away now, but he was a great, great man, and what he was a genius. He was dating the Sphinx and the enclosure and the pyramids of Egypt so far back that even the dating that Graham Hancock and Randall are arguing wasn't even far back enough. And the reason I say that is because there's a term in ancient Egypt called Zeb Tepi. It's written in a lot of the ancient walls throughout the Giza Plateau, and it talks about this time, the first time. It talks about when Egypt started, and its name used to be Kem or Kemet with a K. It was the land of Kem. And it's really kind of weird that you pointed out that Shem sounds just like Kem.
Yeah.
Like, just like it, right?
Very similar.
It's almost the exact same.
Yeah.
Shem, Kem. And this has shown us, it's telling us that, look, this was one of the bloodline sons of Sayasudra. They were like superhuman, basically, and they created the Great Pyramids of Giza. Now, I want to get back again to what I was saying. So Robert Bavall and John Anthony West, they're in Giza, and this is what, like 1988, 1991, or some, I don't know, I might not get that date exactly right. But they're there before anybody is talking about this. And they're looking at the Sphinx enclosure, and they're realizing that, look, this is not caused by wind erosion. This is caused by weather erosion, 100%, like clearly. And they're aligning the King and Queen's chamber in the Great Pyramid to star constellations of Sirius and Orion's belt. And they're realizing, hey, these don't line up. These don't line up 4,000 or 5,000 years ago at all. And then they're like, well, we don't have any pharaohs ever buried in them. We know they're not tombs. In fact, the entire story about Khufu may have been a complete fabrication. There's strong evidence, and I don't remember the gentleman's name off my head. There's strong evidence of the person who discovered that name written fabricated it himself. That there's never a name ever of Khufu anywhere in the Great Pyramid at all. And to this day, we find it only in one place. So weird, right?
Yes.
Because Khufu had nothing to do with it. In fact, the pyramids were likely built 10,000 years or more before Khufu. So, this is how the story went for a little history lesson on people. John Anthony West and Robert Bauval, they contact an awesome geologist who they're friends with named Robert Schoch. And Robert Schoch is a trained geologist. And at first, he was apprehensive of the whole concept they were trying to push for, which is like exactly what you want. You want to have a scientist who isn't biased on any kind of an answer and is there to just look at the evidence. And that's what he did. They flew him out to Giza. Robert Bauval walked up, and he's like literally one of the best geologists in the world. He walks up to the walls, and he looks at it, and he's like, that's not wind erosion. Boom. And he then sat down, and I think he had to try to wrap his head around changing the paradigm, because I don't think at that point he had thought that was going to be what he expected, as far as I know of Robert Schoch's story, and I love that man very much. But then he proposed it, and you think Graham Hancock got lambasted?
Oh, yeah. That's
Robert Schoch was a full-on academic who's got multiple degrees, and he was a very well-trained geologist, and he got completely destroyed. He proposed that the Sphinx enclosure was water and not wind, and because there hasn't been enough water on the Giza Plateau until at least 12,000 years ago, all of a sudden we got a problem. Okay? And so that's how the whole thing started. Meanwhile, Graham Hancock goes to Ethiopia, and he's as part of a journalism exploit, and he finds out that, shoot, they're supposedly had the Ark of the Covenant here? And so it's interesting how these men got started and how all this whole thing started, but that's how it all started. If for a little history lesson, if everybody forgot. And then those very brave men, all of them, Robert Schoch, Robert Bauval, John Anthony West, Graham Hancock, Randall Carlson, and there's definitely a couple I'm missing. They spearheaded this entire thing to try to get to the truth of alternative lost civilizations in history. And John Anthony West believed that looking at the alignments of Leo with the Great Sphinx, that he believed that Zeb Tepi was referring to 38,000 years ago. Okay, so we're going to call it 40, so we can just call it 40.
Just to stop you for a minute, I hate that it's like even labeled like alternative history.
I know.
Or anything. It should be, I'm not going to think of a good name off the top of my head, but like, we are exploring things that we are constantly mounting evidence for. We don't have the hardest evidence to say absolutely this, absolutely that, including anything you've said today. So that just points out half the problem right there, but please continue.
So then we started to have to relook at, well, what did the pyramids really get built for? Like, we already knew that they weren't built as tombs. There was no tombs. There were false boxes, false sarcophagi. But we find those in the Serapeum as well. Do you know what the Serapeum is?
No.
Serapeum is this unbelievable subterranean chamber that goes down under Giza into the aquifer water systems. And there are these granite boxes that are like 50, 60 tons underground, and they're bigger than the entrance to get in. So like, nobody has any comprehension of how they built them, how they got down there, what their purpose was. But we find this signature across Giza. Remember, this whole idea of like reincarnation and tracing death, of these empty stone sarcophagus that are like massive and beautiful, but there's no one in them, and no one can go in them. So what that means, we still don't know. But they're not for Apis bulls, I can tell you that.
They're not for what?
The Egyptian authorities with Zahi Hawass say that they were created to bury the bones of Apis bulls as a ceremonial thing. And it's just, there's no evidence of that in the whole. The more they try to like create these theories for why things are built, the more that anyone's well-educated that's least open-minded is getting frustrated because it's stupid.
Yeah.
And so the Great Pyramids of Giza, they seem to have been built by this lost civilization that understood cycles. Now, if you look at it, it's built exactly on what's called the 30th parallel. Okay? Now, what's bizarre, as I was mentioning, that civilizations didn't seem to care just at the availability of water and other things. It was about energetically and being in this certain location. Now, the 30th parallel is an region of Earth that covers this line across above the equator, right? When we look at some of the most ancient sites on Earth, you ready for this?
Yes.
The Great Pyramids of Giza, Eridu, and the Sumerian cities, as well as places like Angkor Wat in Southeast Asia, and some others, they're exactly found on the 30th parallel. Exactly. It means that around the world, they're exactly on the same line. Like everything was done on purpose. Like everything.
And how far back again is the estimation?
You know, and like I said, John Anthony West wrote a fantastic book called Serpent in the Sky. That's what it's called, right? Because, and I have this whole theory where the law of correspondence above and below, I believe that the pre-Diluvians, the cities of Sumer, like Eridu and Shuruppak, and the Euphrates River were actually designed to mimic the constellation of Eridanus. There's a constellation called Eridanus that is supposed to be the serpent in the sky, and it leads from Orion's belt. So if we look at these ancient Sumerian cities and the Euphrates River, and how Göbekli Tepe is at the headwaters, just so you know, Göbekli Tepe is at the headwaters of the Euphrates River, the very beginning of it. Okay, and these other cities are at the end, and then the Great Pyramids of Giza are built to be basically the three belt stars of Orion. And what it shows you is that it's like they're trying to make the constellations in the sky.
Do you think there was?
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, this is a wide open question that I guess the answer is yeah, possibly. But when I start seeing perfection like that on a mass scale,
yeah,
not just in person, but when you talk about distance across society,
yeah,
and I consider maybe the lack of certain innovations that even advanced civilizations had, which we've talked about already today, I'm like, this has to be something otherworldly doing this.
That's what I mean. I spent about 30 minutes talking about the Anuna. Because how could that not be?
Yeah.
I think it's what is that? Okay, there's a famous quote that, you know, Sherlock Holmes, who wasn't really a detective, but he wrote the books, right? I love that quote he says, because I use it in all my last two books. He has this quote in there about when you're trying to figure something out. Do you remember this?
No.
His famous quote is, can you pull it up really quick? I don't want to butcher it.
Yeah.
Just look up Sherlock Holmes quote. His name's not really that. Sir Arthur Doyle.
Sir Arthur Doyle quote about what?
I want you to read it really quick because I don't want to accidentally say it wrong. Sir Arthur Doyle, just say his quote. It's the most famous quote in history. Whatever remains, it must be the truth. I think it's
have mediocrity knows nothing higher than itself.
Just type whatever remains must be the truth. Yeah. So and
okay, you want the quote?
Yeah. Please read it because I want to make sure I don't get it wrong.
Let me pull it over
Yeah.
here.
Yeah, I think it's one of the most profound quotes ever said.
When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
Thank you. So what you just said, it's so hard to wrap our heads around what the Anuna are and what they could be, or even just what the influences that gave rise to any of these civilizations were and the knowledge. But at the end of the day, I have to admit, it seems impossible. It's purely just humans with no influences. And I think that that's the bottom line, is that everything that I've uncovered and many others, I think even like some others I won't mention them names would admit too, is that it just seems completely impossible, like that quote said, that all that remains that makes sense is that all that knowledge and all those things that were brought and all that, it wasn't from here. That's it. It wasn't from here. And I think that's the best way to say it.
Possible.
So you wanted to hear about the Great Pyramid of Giza.
Yes.
We talked about its location. It's really weird, and I think someone like Graham Hancock's a lot better at discussing it than I am, but if you look at the Great Pyramid of Giza, it's like a half ratio of the entire Earth. Perfect. And if you look at the location it is on the Earth, the location it is the same number of the speed of light and everything.